So would Brenda?
No.
So,
Yes.
No. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all here today. We actually got a pretty good crowd. So this is our second to last real meeting of the semester. So we're only gonna have one more guest speaker come in and do a talk. After that will be our end of the year party, just kind of a fun game night sort of thing. We'll have pizza, stuff like that. And so that will be May 2nd. And for the first time this semester, we will not be in this room. We will actually be in the SSA, 4th floor. A more exact location will be sent out at some point. I'm not sure which room on the 4th floor.
Gotta be someplace where they'll let us have food.
Yes, it will be someplace where they'll let us have food.
Yeah.
That's why it won't be here.
Yeah. So, anyway, so the speaker that we were going to have tonight, Steve Lee, was not able to make it out. It was kind of a last minute family emergency type deal. So instead we are going to have Alan Hamlin give the talk tonight. So I'll go ahead.
All right, thanks, Seth. Yeah, sorry guys, you don't have Steve Lee and his great sense of humor tonight, but we'll give it a shot here, as I did have a canned presentation on the problem of evil from November of 2021. So I don't think too many of y'all heard that, and I asked a couple people that were here then, and they're like, yeah, I don't really remember a whole lot about it, so I think we'll be okay. I swapped out a few slides. But yeah, we're going to look at what I think is one of the most challenging objections to Christianity. For me, I would say, yeah, it is the most challenging objection, looking at the problem of evil and suffering. Why does it exist? Things like that. So we want to try to not just give, throughout the course of the year now, we've given a lot of positive arguments for God's existence and the truth of Christianity, a lot of evidence. But we also need to respond to objections, and things are a little complicated. We have to admit this can be challenging, so we want to try to deal with this challenge tonight. So I hope you guys will join in and make it interactive and discussion-oriented, and feel free to ask questions. It's good to see a number of people who haven't maybe seen in a while here, and glad y'all made it out in the midst of your busy schedules. I know this time of year can be really busy, so we're glad to have you here. All right, so yeah, one thing I'd like to mention, we all have, if you haven't had it yet, maybe you've had an easy life as a young person, but eventually, right, you'll probably have some very significant challenges yourself in the areas of suffering, either yourself or a loved one going through terrible sickness or death or whatever. It is a fallen world. It's something that hits everyone, but in different ways. So in my own situation, we found out years ago that we have a son who turned out to be handicapped. I have 2 sons, 2 daughters. They're all older now, adults. But it was a bit challenging to deal with, trying to just deal with you have certain expectations when you have a son or daughter, and you want them obviously to be in best possible health, and you find out things, it's like, oh no, it's got this problem, and then you find out it's got this other problem. In the case of David, he's very deaf, really no hearing at all. He has mental challenges as well. He's sort of like a 4th grader, which actually now it's kind of fun. It's like you've got a kid around the house at all times. He loves video games, and he's just oriented more that way. He has cerebral palsy, but that turned out not to be too bad. For a while, we weren't sure if he'd be able to walk, but he walks fine with a limp now at one point. So, but yeah, his brothers and sisters just love him. He had a happy upbringing. There's a couple of his sisters with him when he was a bit younger there. I think it was good for my other kids, actually, to have a sibling who had special needs. You learn a lot more about empathy and helping others and being more unselfish, because sometimes they had to watch out for David. But yeah, sometimes it's kind of funny. We took this picture a few years back on a cruise ship, and we bought the picture just because it was so funny. It's just like he's just looking up, just in a different world there. Saw something that caught his eye, probably as an autistic kid, but he's really easy now. He's real fun. It's really a great life. It's not at all a challenge now, but to be honest, it was when he was young, and I think he was frustrated with the lack of communication, so he had somewhat of an independent, rebellious spirit as a kid, as even people have that are not deaf or whatever. But anyway, that's just an example of how, I've had some of my own challenges, but I don't claim it to be anything that significant at all, especially at this point. It's not I don't view it in any kind of, as a trial at all anymore. But yeah, I think we can start off by looking at how people who object to Christianity on the basis of the problem of evil, how do they frame the problem, and kind of unpack that a bit. So you could put it in the form of a syllogism like this. If there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, then why do you have evil? It seems like, he would, well, obviously the other part of this, I guess I should finish that and then unpack it. There's no doubt that we have evil in this world. You see it in the ongoing wars that we have, natural disasters. I'm sure everyone in here has been impacted by someone stealing, lying, doing something bad to you, right? So there's definitely evil in the world. But you could argue, for example, that if God is all-powerful, he'd be able to get rid of all evil. If he's all-knowing, he'd know about all of it. And if he's all-good, he would want to get rid of it. Okay, so you do have a bit of a challenge in responding to that. Obviously, what we'll get into later is, really looking at, okay, the Christian view actually is that God is going to eliminate all evil. It's just that he hasn't done it yet. He gives people time to repent, to be redeemed, and so forth. So there's a lot more to be said on that throughout the presentation, but that might be the quick 1-minute response to show that this is not decisive all by itself. But I think what's interesting is you can kind of turn it around and say, well, wait a minute, one interesting thing that people have observed is that the existence of evil can actually be made into an argument for God's existence. Okay, so it goes like this. If there is no God, there would be no objective moral standard. There's no one that would really determine what is right and wrong. Everything you believe about morality would have been something that you came to through some kind of evolutionary process. That's a contingent process. You rewind the tape of evolution, you could have had different morals. People if somebody in another area of the universe evolved, they might have different moral views than you. Of course, we have them even within this world. But they could be radically different. You really have no basis for saying something is objectively wrong. But I think our reaction to evil, even people like, say, Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, he has a problem with, for example, religious people doing evil things. He makes a big deal about different aspects there. He seems to treat it, if you look carefully at how he argues, he treats it as objectively wrong, not just like, oh, we disagree about whatever, priests abusing little children. No, he says, it's like it's wrong in all possible worlds, kind of an approach to the issue, which I agree with. I think he's right about that. It's just that on his worldview, you can't really ground the basis for objective morality. All right, so yeah, if you can argue with this, and this is a whole other talk, probably really dig into the details, but there is a decent argument that can be made for just saying, well, look, if there really is objective evil in the world, then there would need to be some kind of God to ground it. And in fact, we've talked about the moral argument. Every year we have one talk on the moral argument, which is basically what this gets into. But it's worth mentioning in this context briefly. The other thing to mention, and this came up in our recent World Religion series, is that, it's actually a problem to deal with evil in any worldview. Okay? So yes, I would admit that it's one of the more challenging things for Christianity to deal with. But does Christianity deal with it better than other worldviews? I would argue yes. And therefore it shouldn't really count against Christianity evidentially. For example, on atheism or naturalism, if there's no God, and we kind of hit on this on the previous slides, but you can't really complain about things being objectively wrong. If someone goes against you, in fact, I think a lot, if you really work out a naturalistic view, as most atheists are, like nature's all there is, everything you do because of, forces of nature. Okay, if that's true, you don't even have free will. And so you can't really say someone is doing choosing to do wrong against you and things like that. It really undermines your ability to complain about evil and things like that. So that's kind of weird. Yeah, I mean, Dawkins himself, the atheist I just mentioned, he has this famous quote that there's no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I think he argues persuasively on his worldview that those are the outworkings of his worldview. The problem is we don't really live in that world that he describes, and so I think you should view that as a problem for your worldview if you can't even say evil exists. Yeah, Landon.
And people have a tendency to apply that, their materialists will apply it to the world. They'll want to apply it to the cosmos and the universe, physical world.
Yeah.
But then they like try to draw a separation between that and human existence.
Yeah.
Which seems to go against their own principles, that humans are just another collection of particles.
Yeah. Now it's, so yeah, they lack the objective standard, as we've been discussing, for complaining about evil. But yeah, the last point came up last week with Raj here. He was mentioning, for example, how on Hinduism, there's the claim, now maybe not all Hindu, there's a lot of variety within Hinduism or Buddhism, as we discussed, but at least mainstream Hinduism actually tries to say that evil itself is an illusion, or what they call Maya, that there's not really this evil going on in the world, it's illusory, and that's why you need to sort of meditate and reset your mind to just not deal with it. But I think as we all know here, evil is very real. If you're involved on either side in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or things like that, you're seeing a lot of suffering and problems, and there's evil. All right. Interestingly, C.S. Lewis, he had this interesting quote where he said, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And so the more he reflected on it, what initially for him created some doubts about God or disbelief about God, he started realizing that actually, if he's right and really thinking that everything is objectively messed up in this fallen world, and he lived through World War I, where he was injured, and World War II, obviously, he saw a lot of evil on the mainland continent of Europe during that era, as well as the island where he lived. Okay, so yeah, let's kind of break it down into different categories, because there's a couple of ways to frame a problem of evil, which I was just talking with Byron about. So there's the emotional problem of evil. Like, I've been wronged. It was emotionally hard for me when I found out my son was handicapped and had these various issues. And what do you do to help someone in that situation? You don't break out a bunch of intellectual reasons and like, oh, God could still exist, even though you might be upset with him right now, or you might think you've gotten the short end of the stick in some way in life. You want to rather comfort those people, help them through it, and you see that very clearly communicated in the Bible, where Job's friends were the ones condemned as they were trying to. Now, of course, their answers were also bad. They were trying to give Job, but yeah, really the right thing to do would just be join with those who are suffering and help them in those hard situations. Yes?
I like that you mentioned about Job, because I've read the story so many times, and in the passage it talks about that God tells the devil not to take away Job's life, but to continue taking away all his stuff. In a situation, Job was faultless. I guess we'll say he was faultless to some extent. Why did God continue pushing Satan to keep punishing him when, he already proved it multiple times that like he wasn't going to waver, even to the point where his wife told him to curse God and die.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, right? That whole book of the Bible deals with this very question of the problem of evil. And I think the main lessons you can take from that book are perhaps, one, that don't assume that people are in the wrong that are suffering. Like Job's friend, that was one of the faults one of the ways in which God reproved Job's friends is he said, you shouldn't be trying to accuse Job. And it wasn't that Job was perfect, right? But it wasn't that he committed more sins than someone else. In fact, he was less sinful than other people around him. But still, God allowed Satan to bring about these problems. He had various family members die, and he himself was afflicted with these boils and so forth. Very hard situation, right? So yeah, why would God allow that? Within the book, you don't see a direct answer, right? You get to the end of the book, and there's a lot there about God saying, where were you when I created the world? And talks about these various ways in which we would have trouble understanding God's ways. And so you're not getting a specific reason. At the same time, think about it. We're reading this book. We're being impacted today by learning some things from Job. It wasn't like it was totally without purpose for God to allow Job to go through suffering. Did you want to add something? Help me out on that, because that is a challenging question.
No, it is. I think that at the beginning of the book of Job, you actually do get the answer because Satan comes to God and he really is taunting God, saying, I can get, this is the Byron paraphrase, but I can get Job to curse you, right? He loves you right now because you've blessed him. He's wealthy. He's got all this. But watch me take stuff away, and he'll curse you. And God allows, and that's important to understand. God allows Satan to go and do what he did to Job, right? But he did it. God allowed Satan to do it because he knew Job would not curse him, because he knew Job to be a righteous man. That despite all of that, Job was going to remain faithful to God. And God was demonstrating that to Satan. And now I think when it comes to Job 38, when you start getting the questions, when it comes to Job 38, you find Job getting weary of the boils and all of that. And after all of Job's friends come, God then steps in Job 38. And he says, now, gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you a question. Why? Because 1 through 37, Job's been asking God a lot of questions. And in 38, God says, I'm going to ask you some questions. And so then he goes through all these questions. Where were you when I stretched out the heavens? Where were you? And what God's saying is, despite what has happened in your life, I am in control of all of it. I caused the grass to grow. I created this. You are my creation, and I care for it specifically. And then you realize at the end of Job, right? What happens? He returns all to Job 100-fold. Right? So it was God showing Job not only his position, God's position, but Job's relation to him. And now the question would be, well, again, if God is all loving and all powerful, then why? He already knew Job was going to do that. Why would he push Job like that?
Well,
Right?
It's a story that's impacted literally millions of people around the world over many generations. As we've seen Job's example, we can find strength and that we can persevere through problems. Yeah, please help us out some more here on this.
Just one other thing to point out. Notice he left his wife. Took away everything good.
Yeah.
He left the wife.
Okay. So you're implying that, well, she did cause him some challenges, didn't she?
She was part of the suffering.
She was part of the suffering. They left her.
She was telling him, curse God and die, right? So, yeah.
It
It shows that God was willing, or Job was persevering even in the midst of that. Yeah.
Was this during Jesus's walk on earth, or was this after, or what?
This was well before it.
Oh, it was.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of people think Job might have been written before any other book in the Bible even.
So who was there to record it?
There's
Exactly
a
like it.
whole host of questions there.
I mean, we're not entirely
The
sure.
question of
but-
whether it was literal or allegorical is a whole other issue.
Yeah, I take it as historical myself, but. All right, so let's jump into different ways of expressing the problem of evil. So yeah, there's the emotional problem I mentioned, and yeah, be careful. You know, you can learn a lot about responding to intellectual objections, and then just want to share that with somebody. It may not be best, right? It's more of something best evaluated when you're more rationally oriented, clear-headed, and not in the midst of some terrible suffering. All right, so the intellectual problem, you can break down though into two different aspects. One you could call the logical version. This would be trying to say that there's a strict contradiction between the existence of a God of the type I mentioned, you know, all good, all knowing, all powerful, and the existence of evil. And then you can also say, well, let's not go that far in terms of a deductive argument, but you can make more of an inductive argument, like there seems to be more suffering going on than you would expect if there's a good God in the world, kind of thing.
What's another argument for deism?
Yeah, I mean, a deist could think God isn't involved in the world, and so they don't even have to explain this aspect. All right, so one interesting thing, you know, sometimes people say you never make progress in philosophy or whatever, you know, people are just talking heads, but actually this is an example where the main secular folks, you know, the mainstream philosophy sort of changed their view, because there was a time at which you had a lot of people claiming that this was a defeater for theism, that some problem of evil and this kind of logical incompatibility, but largely to the work of Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher, he convinced pretty much all the, you know, atheist philosophers that no, there's no contradiction here. So that's a pretty big deal, and that's one of the reasons some people think that Plantinga was, you know, he's one of the leading philosophers. He's a bit old now, but he made a huge impact throughout the latter half of the 20th century in particular. So again, yeah, this would be claiming the coexistence of God and evil is impossible. And so notice that, you know, if you really write it down like this, let me ask you guys, are those statements logically inconsistent? Like if you think about, for those of you that have training, are we looking at like modus ponens, modus tollens? Is it just a straightforward syllogism? Or what do y'all think about that?
There's not exist a direct contradiction between them.
Right. Yeah, they're really, I mean, there's nothing logically inconsistent. I mean, it's easy, you can see how people might think that, but I think Plantinga expressed it well when he said that there's hidden premises in that argument, and you need to expose them and deal with them and see if they really hold up. But here's a quote by William Alston that's pretty powerful. He says, "It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical problem of evil is bankrupt." Obviously, in philosophy, you find any view, you know, solipsism, you yourself are the only thing that exists or whatever. So you're never going to get total unanimity in philosophy, but quite predominantly, even among secular atheist philosophers, they would acknowledge that the logical problem of evil is not a defeater for the belief in God, for theism.
The main thing with that seems like it's like missing the connector between the two. You know,
Yeah.
God exists. If evil exists, then God cannot exist, you know, is what's missing.
Yeah.
So is there anybody that's actually ever tried to put that in there and say, well, here's why the two are inconsistent, as opposed to just a feeling that they are?
Yeah, I mean, and Plantinga himself tries to really unpack and deal with, you know, arguments that people have raised in that regard. He tries to say, look, you have these hidden assumptions that, first of all, that God would definitely create a world without evil. You know, is one of sort of the hidden assumptions. But, if you think about the nature of relationships, many of you here probably want to get married. You want to have a loving relationship with a spouse. Some of you are already married here. And that's not something you can force, right? I mean, if there's an AI robot or something, it might say it loves me, but it doesn't really love me, right? I mean, you just can't force love. You've got to have free will if you're going to have a loving relationship. And so you could see why, love is the highest virtue. The most significant relationship we could have with God would entail that we have some measure of free will. We're not just his puppets robotically responding to him. I mean, look at how we value freedom in our world. People want freedom. There's a great value in that. But once you introduce true libertarian freedom, where you could have chosen otherwise, of necessity, it becomes logically impossible that you don't have evil. If someone, if you say that couldn't God have created a world without any evil, but also made free will creatures, I think you can show logically that no. I mean, once you give them free will, it's free will. They would be able to be selfish, hurt other people, things like that. Now, God could intervene every time somebody was about to do something wrong or something, but that's kind of a bizarre world, right? That's not really one in which creatures are living in freedom. The view that God is all powerful does not entail that he can do what's logically impossible. Okay, that's no diminishing of God's omnipotence to say that he can't do something logically impossible. For example, make a square circle. It's just that there is no coherent concept of what a square circle would really be. There's no such thing as a square circle. So the fact that God cannot make one doesn't mean he's limited in power. It just means that you're speaking gibberish and nonsense that doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
You could also take it from another angle that if God can do things that are logically impossible, then there's no point arguing about it. Because therefore you can say God can do things that are logically impossible, therefore he can still be all loving while creating a world that has evil in it, even though an all loving God who created a world without evil.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah, so you really run into problems as the skeptic arguing either direction on that issue. All right, now the other potential hidden premise, the fact that he's all loving, right, also would tend to make him want to create a world without evil. Okay, true enough, at least in the sense of, you can ask the question, is it logically impossible, though, that for God to have, morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil for a time period? That kind of thing you get into. Yeah.
Going back just a second.
Sure.
He did create a world without evil, but he still gave them choice.
Yes.
Okay? Because, and I've had several arguments about this, that if, why wouldn't he have never created the tree? Why would he not have done that? And the thing is he wanted them to have free will and choice.
Yeah. And it wasn't like,
day,
he was like tempting them in this real tricky way or something. It's just like, you got one rule. And yet I know if I was there too, I'm sure I would have fallen as well. So, yeah.
Does that suggest that if God had created the world without that one tree, basically, that the people would not have had free will, or would that still be a possibility?
I think she's getting at a scenario maybe where someone raised that to her as a question. I would argue that you would still have free will even without the tree, right? I mean, they were put in charge to garden it. What am I going to plant today? A whole host of free will decisions. And it's hard to see how it wouldn't have been possible for Adam to be very selfish towards Eve or vice versa or something of that nature. But in this particular case, there's here's one very well-defined rule, very tangible, that God gave them, and they violated it. So,
I will say it doesn't seem like they would have full free will, and the fact that that might not be they're being completely puppeted all the time in some kind of completely predetermined way, but just because like the tree wasn't just the tree of evil, it was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't there, then God would have at that point just been completely cutting off all knowledge of the existence of evil, and thus just
That's a good
not
point.
allowing them to ever access that, part of what their free will could encompass.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good point.
Well, and if God simply never gave them a command of something not, if he never gave them a prohibition.
Yeah.
Or any kind of prescription either way, and just gave them no instructions whatsoever, then they would still have free will, but it wouldn't mean anything in the context of God himself.
Yeah, to put it as a, breaking a moral law given by God, you have to give some moral law. So,
And then it wouldn't be evil.
yeah. All right, all good thoughts. You're helping me understand this better. So yeah, Plantinga argued that it's logically possible that even all natural evils are the result of an evil supernatural being abusing free will. Now this was more of a hypothetical put forth by Plantinga. So let me back up a step. So you could say, for example, that okay, God wanted to create free will creatures so we could have loving relationship. Fine. That opens up the possibility for all human against human kinds of evils. But what about natural disasters or something of that nature? Okay, now here, Plantinga used more of just a hypothetical. And he said, what if, and this ties into maybe the book of Job a little bit, what if every possible natural disaster was also the product of evil supernatural beings such as Satan or his demons or whatever? Then that would still be in the category of creatures having free will and just misusing it. And so that's not, he's just showing from a philosophy standpoint, there's no way you can show a logical contradiction because of possibilities like that. So, and we'll talk more about that later in the evidential problem as well. All right, so, yeah, the other point, of course, is that we think as Christians that God does have a plan for ending evil, but his patience is what is allowing people to make a choice to be redeemed and to find forgiveness in Christ and things of that nature. And the same could apply for demons or Satan himself. He's at least giving him an option to repent. All right, so I think that we have a pretty satisfactory answer to the logical problem of evil. If someone's trying to claim it's just a direct logical contradiction, that argument seems to fail for sure. However, it is more difficult to deal with the so-called evidential problem of evil. And here, yeah, you're looking at, isn't there more evil than you would expect with a good God? And is some of it really gratuitous, where it doesn't seem to serve any purpose? And that kind of a thing.
How do you evaluate that? What's the standard for how much is the right amount of evil?
Well, yeah, that's one of the challenges we'll talk about and try to deal with this. Did you have a question or comment?
I mean, a lion eats a zebra because he needs to eat. That's not evil.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So people can't, I mean, Agent Orange, that stuff that they poured on people, that's evil.
That's evil, for sure.
But if we're comparing it to, say, I guess back to what you were saying about the whole, like, I kind of look at it as like, sort of like, are you familiar with like the Hunger Games, sort of like how God just kind of looked at it as like, okay, I'm giving you guys a free will, and sort of at the end, I'm sort of going to clean up in a way, right? So like, I'm a psych major, so we're learning about all like the different experiments and the atrocities that happen with all the experiments.
Oh
and
yeah,
so,
those are interesting. You know a lot more about them than I do, but I've heard some.
like in the Milgram experiment where they were tasked to shock people and they wanted to see how much obedience. If that was an actual person, I guess my question is that if evil exists, right? If I break into your house and steal your stuff, that's evil, right?
Sure.
Well, you have to define the evil. I mean, what if, you're hungry and you break into the house to steal food, you're the same as the lion taking the zebra?
Well, it's still wrong.
Well, you still have that. Again, it comes to defining, you have to define evil. What exactly is evil?
Because if you don't have the rules or the regulations that says don't steal, you don't know that it's evil.
Yeah, what's the moral basis?
Well, what's the moral basis for that? So if there's no God, there's no moral basis, so what's the difference between that and the lion?
At the same time, I mean, I can understand the skeptical objection to Christianity of saying, well, maybe you're not consistent in your own view, though, or something like you believe in this morality, and you believe that God wants to minimize evil, but there just seems to be more of it than I expect. Again, it's very intangible, but that's the nature of this evidential argument. What else, Seth?
Yeah, I will definitely point out that the problem of evil still works as a internal critique,
Exactly.
even if the atheist can't justify where evil comes from. And I think atheism has its own problem of evil, but Christianity
Right.
still has an internal
We have to
problem
deal
of
with
evil.
this, and
But yeah, secondarily though, I do think you bring up a good point with like the lion and the zebra of like that's not technically evil, but I think that's where there's kind of two strains of this problem: the problem of evil and really just the problem of suffering in general.
Yeah.
That could also be invoked that perhaps it's not evil, but it's still immense suffering, and it still is a big question of why would God make a universe in which that was the way that the lion had to operate to get food. And I think that's also a challenging problem as well.
Yep.
And what about cannibalism? Is that evil? What's evil?
I certainly think so. Yeah, let's move on here for sake of time. Apparently our president was talking about cannibalism recently for his uncle or something, but yeah. So yeah, we do have this challenge then from the evidential problem. But notice I think the first thing you want to do if someone's raising this challenge is go ahead and let them make the case, right? They need to show why it's impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons to allow evil and suffering. They're the ones trying to make the challenge. They need to articulate the reasons that it seems to be impossible in their view, and then look at if that really holds up or not. So what I'm going to give you in the next section here are, I think, mistakes made in evaluating the evidential problem of evil. In other words, these are areas where, yeah, it can seem like there's more evil than you expect, but it's often because we're making these mistakes in how we're viewing it and evaluating it. And there's just a number of these I'm going to list out here. So, for example, sometimes, you can start really pondering and thinking about the totality of human suffering in the entire history of humanity. And that's just overwhelming, right? But then you can also back up and say, well, wait a minute, any one person doesn't experience all that suffering. I mean, it's still a problem, right? None of these are sufficient by themselves to explain away the evidential problem of evil, but they're just ways in which people make mistakes in evaluating it. So if you're thinking always of like the totality, that's not really properly accounting for the average person suffering. So, I mean, obviously, yeah, if most people had more suffering than they wanted to make life worth living, they would be committing suicide. Now, some people do commit suicide, sadly, unfortunately, but often they have, mental issues that are contributing to that and so forth. But most people are happy enough with life. They want to continue living and so forth. And the average experience for most people is one of less suffering than pleasure, you could say, in some sense. Yeah.
I guess a better way to, or at least in my opinion, a better way to rephrase that sentence would be, for most people, suffering is not such that they would rather have not existed, which
Perfect.
is very complicated. A very complicated way of saying it, but I guess
No, thanks
it's
for
still as
throwing that
dismissive
in.
then
That
it's not really
sounds
that bad.
like a good way to express it. Okay. Now, more significantly, I think we can say that often people arguing against reasons for suffering might not be accounting for benefits of suffering. Okay, now at first glance you can say, wait a minute, are there really benefits to suffering? Often it doesn't seem like it at the time, right? But think about, let's start with just physical pain in general. What is the purpose of physical pain? And what happens if you take it away? Have y'all thought about that much? Yes.
I just think of like the classic example of a kid like their hand on the stove, right? Like
Yeah.
if you didn't have pain, if a kid was curious and they touched a hot stove for some reason, if they didn't feel that, they'd just burn their hand off. You know,
Yeah.
so like your body naturally wants to protect itself, and so part of that is pain, which could relate to suffering, but at the same time, it's protecting you.
Very well put. Yeah, I mean, I remember when my kids were 2, you know, they were not of the mindset to not want to be rebellious and do their own thing, and we definitely needed that pain to help preserve them at that point. Yeah.
I mean, the idea of someone not being able to feel pain at all isn't really a hypothetical. I mean, it's rare, but people are born
Actually,
with
yeah,
that
we're going to
condition.
talk about that
Yeah.
a little bit.
And
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest reasons is to remind us how mortal we are, because we see a lot of people, especially young people, just thinking they can do anything and everything, and that's an example of just generally like everyone's like, oh, phew, they're older now, like they're humbled or whatever. I think that it would be really easy to get carried away and forget. I don't want to say forget that we have problems, but in terms of sanctification, there's just a lot of implications about physical pain on like a greater spiritual level.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's what you were wanting to go with this.
No, that's a
or
good
just
point that
talking
I
about-
don't have in these slides that I'll maybe comment on and reiterate, is that I know a lot of, I mean, I'm getting older now. I know a lot of people more in my generations or slightly older, they're having to confront more the fact that, hey, I'm actually going to die in a number of years. My mom just fell and broke her hip recently and is living in a rehab center. She's 83. It's like, she's fine because she's a Christian, but like her roommate is talking a lot about how she's afraid of dying, and it really makes you confront, and think about God and spiritual things more than you tend to if you're a lot younger. Sometimes just like you feel invincible. I'm going to live forever. I'm living for today. You're not worried. So it has that effect big time. Yeah.
One last thing. I've had chronic illness for
I was
20
thinking
plus
about
years.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, I was diagnosed with MS when I was 28. I had started having symptoms when I was 18. The thing is though, I've been progressively diagnosed with more additional things, but I will tell you, no matter what I had, no matter what experience, no matter what, I'm able to talk to other people about things, and even if I go through it, it's something I can do, and I can help other people get through it too. So I no matter what I've been through, no matter what it's going with, I've always been able to use it to help somebody else.
Thanks for sharing that. I would have brought it up, but it's like, no, she needs to bring that up
I'm okay.
if
You
she
can
wants
throw
to
it out
talk
there.
about it. But yeah, and your attitude is very commendable toward that, and you're helping others see the benefits that can happen. Even though I'm sure you wouldn't have chosen that. It's been super hard, but there can be positive things come out of even something that's.
That's it. No matter what, even if you go through it, you can learn something yourself. I'm not saying that there isn't a problem happening, but you can learn something yourself and you can help somebody else with it.
I'm sure there are ways where you can help people that I or others who could not have helped at all, because you can come alongside and sympathize with what they're going through far better. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, yeah, let's mention the thing Seth brought up, which is kind of interesting. So, and yeah, we mentioned like staying away from flame as being an obvious thing. But these are warning signs. So just as physical pain has a purpose, other kinds of pain can help be warning signs like, hey, you're living the wrong lifestyle. You're living for yourself. You're not happy because you're not right with God and others. God's made you to live a certain way. You're violating that. That's leading to a lot of your problems. Again, that's not to say that all problems fit in that category, but some of them do. Okay, so here's an article. There was an article from almost 10 years ago now in the New Scientist where they made a breakthrough that is allowing for the first time people that have this kind of pain disorder that Seth mentioned to feel pain. They're able to give them a drug, and for the first time in their whole life, they can feel pain. So there's an article about this woman who has never felt pain, experiences it for the first time. And I don't know if you can see the caption. I have to get closer here, but she's actually thankful that she can feel the pain. She wanted to feel it. It's kind of interesting. She says she quite liked the experience. So, I know, kind of weird.
She's gonna seek out painful experiences now.
Yeah, right. I'm sure there's a balance, right? She might feel a little bit, but
Well, I can imagine it would be similar to like going on a roller coaster, like you're choosing to be scared to death, and you're choosing to have weird, like butterflies in your stomach, anxiety, just on purpose going on a roller coaster because it's an experience. You know, I can imagine
Yeah.
it would be something like that.
and if you've never felt it at all, right? It's just this new thing,
Yeah.
and you feel more like, oh, this is what other people are like, you know?
Well, it might make you have a better perspective on the good stuff that you experience as well.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you know what, that was pleasurable, but I don't really have anything to measure it against until I have the other end.
Yeah, you know, I'm pretty healthy by nature, thankfully, so far. But yeah, it's those few times where I'm sick, it gives me a lot better reminder of like, hey, I have a lot to be thankful for that I take for granted almost all the time just to be in decent health. Okay, another mistake we make sometimes is underestimating the amount of evil that is due to human rebellion. Clearly not all of it is, right? If you got a tsunami or something. But more of it than we often think is, particularly when you look at, say, poorer countries and different issues like that. Sometimes, you know, even foreign aid is not getting in because, you know, gangs are taking it and using it for themselves and not letting the people get it. Or corrupt political systems are causing problems for the populace, different things like that. I think clearly the worst suffering is more human-induced. And sometimes even the natural evils are worsened by human mistakes. When there is a famine or an earthquake, you know, if you have places that didn't build according to code or didn't, you know, do things like that, well, they're impacted a lot more when you have that earthquake or whatever. But again, it's not saying that they wouldn't have had suffering, period. Let's keep moving for sake of time here. Another one that was brought up briefly was reflecting on the impact of evil supernatural forces. So I'd be fine with someone making an argument and saying, look, we see this certain evil around here, therefore there's, you know, some evil supernatural force. That's probably a reasonable deduction. So if we didn't have any evil supernatural forces, we might live in a world where we had far less suffering and evil. And, you know, again, you can argue that God is allowing these evil creatures some measure of freedom just like he allows us. If he ended evil today, where would that put us, right? If, you know, if we're still in a rebellious state, or if that happened before I had accepted Christ as my Savior, I would be separated from God. I mean, his patience in that area is very important. He doesn't. No one really wants him to end evil right away.
Well, and Christianity addresses that very specifically with the explanation of Satan and the demons and so forth.
Right.
Which again gets, you know, how does Christianity explain it? Does it? It does. As compared with other religions, they may not address the issue.
Yeah, and admittedly, you do have the problem such as was brought up with Job, where we do believe that God is more powerful than Satan. He's in control ultimately, but he is deciding to give a certain measure of freedom and allow these kind of supernatural forces to cause some havoc in some cases. But it seems to be the case that it's when he has you know, some positive benefit coming out of it as well that he allows it. So you might prove there's a devil because of evil, but it doesn't disprove God, as Frank Turk likes to say. So yeah, you know, actually, if you look carefully at the New Testament, there's some pretty powerful verses, right? Where it calls Satan the god of this age in 2 Corinthians. Jesus says he's the ruler of this world. So, you know, he does have a measure of freedom to act in this world that causes a lot of problems. I think also often we, in evaluating the evidential problem of evil, we don't really account for eternity. So we mentioned Job, you know, he was repaid even in this life more than he lost. But what about, you know, someone that goes through suffering? On the Christian view, God is, you know, we're all eternal beings, and God is able to compensate. He's able to make up. Yes, some people have it harder than other people, but whatever suffering we have for a finite period of time can be dwarfed by God's ability to bless someone for all eternity, right? I mean, your total amount of good is going to infinitely outweigh the suffering when you look at that mathematical limit, so to speak. So if you really account for eternity, it can change the equation in terms of that evaluation of, well, is it more suffering than I expect? Maybe it is. If this world was all there is, maybe that is a valid argument. But when you start thinking about eternity, that changes the math completely. Fraction of finite suffering goes to zero, and the limit towards the blissful eternity. And you see this expressed by Paul again in 2 Corinthians. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison.
Also, Romans 8:18, I consider our present suffering not worth comparing to the glory to be revealed in us.
Yeah, that's a really good one as well. I mean, on my view, God is putting us in situations that maximize the likelihood of people freely accepting Christ. And some of that involves suffering, because you're going to be an example that leads someone else to Christ. It can involve a whole host of complicated things, which we don't really have insight into that, right? We're finite creatures. We're not seeing the full picture over time or space. But if you start thinking in terms of people's testimonies, often people will share how they came to faith in Christ, and it'll be something to the effect that, I just heard this the other day at my church, I was living for myself totally, and I didn't give God a second thought until I had all this problems come about, suffering. And then all of a sudden they got serious about thinking about God and what's important, and found a much deeper, more fulfilling life, even on this life, after going through. But it's only because they went through hard times they even considered it. And so there can be a purpose for suffering in that as well, if it's able to lead people to an eternity with God as opposed to an eternity separated from God. Yes?
I was going to say, I don't remember which book of the Bible it is or who's talking about it, but I think it's saying that you should count it joy when you go through these hard times because it produces perseverance and it grows your faith.
Yeah.
That's James.
Yeah, there's also I think 2 Timothy, something to that effect as well. It's definitely a theme. Yeah, no, that's hard to do, right?
Yeah.
Count it all joy when you encounter trials, but yeah, that is the perspective, because there's purpose in them, and it goes on to say in James 1 about building character and things like that. And in other cases, it talks about the suffering that Christians went through that led others to faith. You see that a lot in Acts. In the early church, many of them were martyred and killed, but it was said that the seed of the martyrs grew the church. They kept killing them, and they were very, very willing to die, and that had a huge impact on other people. And it also was part of the evidence we used in talking about the resurrection. If you remember, we can look back today and say, well, they're very unlikely to have lied in these claims they saw the risen Jesus, because they had no incentive, because they lived in a culture in which they were persecuted. But if they didn't have that persecution, then we wouldn't have that kind of historical evidence to go with it. Do you have a comment, Byron?
No, just a question.
Okay.
So they're presenting all of the reasons why suffering could be, right? Is there benefit in suffering seems to be the meta question that we're trying to answer.
Yeah.
In your view, is there suffering that is just meaningless? That there is no rhyme, there is no reason? Just
I think a lot of the suffering caused by agency is in that category, in the sense that the human or demonic decisions to do certain things cause problems. By itself, you can say, well, yeah, that some of that might not be very useful or helpful, but it's just a byproduct of free will. But I'm thinking more in the category of natural evils, that it would seem that God would need to have a reason to allow certain disasters to make it worth allowing, because he could have just ended that. That's my thought. You all might disagree, or what do you have to say, Kevin?
I guess one way I would respond to that would be that when we're in heaven, God constantly is going to settle all of our all of our debts. I think that includes all wrong that has been done to us. So these evils that are a result of people freely choosing to do evil, God can use that as an opportunity to demonstrate his justice, both in punishing the evildoer, but also in repaying what was unjustly done to us. That's a further opportunity for him to show his
That's a
love.
good additional thought.
It's not something that we're likely to experience. We could experience in this lifetime, but we may not experience most of that until we're in heaven.
Okay, that ties into this general category of often arguing against the possibility of God allowing evil doesn't really factor in eternity. So you're pointing to some things that could happen even after we die that could fold into play. All right, there's a verse from Acts that talks about what I was talking about God choosing to put people in positions where they would seek him. And sometimes, just as a surgeon must operate for the greater good, so we must undergo suffering. C.S. Lewis said something like, haven't they been to a dentist before? This very pragmatic aspect of like, you can't just rule out that good can come from suffering, because we do it all the time, even as just humans within our world. You go to the dentist's office, they drill on you and do all these unpleasant things, but it's for a greater good. But if your kids go in there, like the shown in the picture here, they're not going to understand, right? And in a sense, we're like kids compared to God, so we don't understand the greater purposes very well either. A sixth point, and I'm going to just try to fly through this since we're getting really short on time, is that we often have, I think, a false sense of purpose, or we have a false assumption about what God's purpose is for us. So if you view God as this, grandfather, he's just spoiling the kids, he wants them all to have ice cream all the time and have this super easy life, then yeah, you might be surprised at the way the world looks. But, we're not just, he's not just trying to make us happy like pets or something like that. I mean, you could use different analogies, like God's preparing us. We're in this world that's fallen. People are doing wrong. He's trying to build character. He's trying to build an understanding of who he is. Those are of higher priority than just always having full immediate joy or something like that, or happiness, you could say. For example, consider, you've probably all seen the studies, right? If you look at wealth, happiness plots, okay, yeah, I mean, if you're super poor, then they're often not very happy because they have it really hard. But once you get to a certain point, it doesn't really make that much difference how much money you have as to how happy you are. And in fact, when you get super rich, often they're really stressed out, worrying about their wealth, or they have other problems. The fact, if you're not that wealthy, you can always think, I'll be happier if I get a little more money or something. But once you get enough, you realize, no, this doesn't help either, and that can itself be depressing.
It's the principle of the hedonic treadmill, right? Humans will adjust their mood to their circumstances based on what they're in, to the point where they are dissatisfied with where they currently are.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So yeah, God's main purpose is he wants us to freely choose to have a relationship with him, to know him. And so yeah, again, I've kind of hit on this already, but anything that would cause people, including like old age, I'm sick, I'm seeking God, I'm thinking about eternity more than I would be if I'm just living in some tropical paradise 24/7 with never a worry in the world. Yeah, to kind of talk through that. One interesting thing that William Lane Craig has pointed out is I tracked down some of the documentation from like missions agencies and so forth, where they track countries and how many are Christian. So, Mao Zedong in China during the Cultural Revolution killed just millions of people in his own country, kicked out all the missionaries. It was really horrible suffering. And yet out of that grew what is now like 100 million plus Christians in China, in house churches, having to conceal their faith often and things like that. But many people came to Christ even in the midst or after the suffering. Or you can look at El Salvador. They had a period in which they endured severe poverty, earthquake, civil war. But then after that, the numbers grew just right on the verge of that, where the number of Christians increased tenfold. Actually had Jaime, who would come here sometimes. He's from El Salvador, by the way, if any of you know him. Ethiopia, similar story there. Really big increase after hard times. I talked about this earlier in the year, and especially since we lack time, I'll mention it. But this is yet another example of somebody who was a secular atheist who saw a lot of suffering becoming a Christian because indirectly the suffering, he saw a Christian response to it and how they were helping people in this worst of times in Ethiopia, and it had a huge impact. He saw something supernatural in these Christians that were helping people, and it sort of went against his scientific Darwinian kind of view. It didn't make sense on an solely evolutionary framework. All right. There's a lot more that we could get into with respect to hell. Christopher Hitchens, he used to liken God to like a North Korean dictator. But really it's the opposite, right? The North Korean dictator, he doesn't allow any dissent within his country or you'll be killed. He's literally killed people in his own family, poisoned them or just assassinated them in various ways. So there's absolutely no freedom, whereas God gives people a lot of freedom. He's not the North Korean dictator. And you could think of hell as sort of being, the end result of if God's just letting people go their own way, it just turns out not to be as good as they thought it was going to be, basically. But I don't have a lot of time to get into that. I want to cover the last point here, is that, I think also when someone's arguing against, the possibility of God allowing evil, they fail to recognize how God does redeem good from evil. In Genesis 50, this is where Joseph, he was sold into slavery by his brothers. He was wrongly accused and got thrown in prison. All these series of horrible things happened. But he told them later, he said to his brothers, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. So, as someone said, it's like he had 50-20 vision. It's a good way to think of that. So moral development of free will creatures is only possible in a world where there's some suffering. The greater the suffering, the more opportunity for compassion. The greater the poverty, the more opportunity for generosity. You can think, for example, of the fall. Why was there a curse when sin entered into the world? When Adam and Eve sinned, there was a certain number of things. You could view them as, it's God's punishment or something, but I think a lot of it too was just, now that we're in a world where everybody's a sinner, these parents are going to give birth to people that have a sin nature, and everybody's just going to be fallen and selfish. What is the best way for people to find God in that world? Well, it may be a world in which they had to work harder to grow crops. It may be a world in which there's more pain, for example, pain in childbirth or whatever. So I view it more, maybe there is a punitive nature to it, but I view it more than anything as, how does God redeem people in a fallen world? Well, you need a world in which it's not just so great that no one wants to have anything to do with God. It needs to actually be a world in which there's some level of suffering. So as Christians, we are called to come alongside and help people. We are to work against suffering. So, that also can be a good witness to the world. And it's been documented. We've talked about it some before, but by Christians starting up things like hospitals and fighting disease and helping people independent of their ability to repay, early Christians missing meals to feed the poor, the whole host of ways in which Christians have made a big difference in trying to alleviate suffering.
And education as well.
Education, absolutely. And actually working to try to build machines to automate things so that you don't have people living in a lower caste doing the tough jobs. So in some cultures where they had more of a caste system, or people that believed in slavery, then, they didn't try to avoid that kind of manual labor. And of course, people who consider themselves Christians have made mistakes in the area of slavery as well, but they were also the ones to lead the way away from that. So the bottom line is, we're not really in a position to assess whether or not God could have morally sufficient reasons to allow suffering. What some would call like the skeptical theist view. Because of our seeing of a localized subset of events in time and space, not seeing the repercussions down the road. I mean, some suffering that happens and then somebody responds to it, it could have an impact, not even in this generation, but some future generation. We just don't have that insight. So you've probably all heard of like the butterfly effect or sort of like chaos theory. A butterfly flaps its wings and, certain tiny changes in initial conditions can result in whether there was a hurricane that formed in the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean or not, kind of thing. It's very unstable. And so it's similar to that, I think, in terms of our complicated world, where we are not in a position to predict what will happen as a result of there being some allowance for suffering or tragedy or natural disasters. All right. Let's go ahead and end it there because we're basically out of time. It gives us just like 3 minutes to for any additional comments or questions that you guys might have. I'm glad most of y'all have kind of spoken up as we've gone. So
Real
that's
quick,
helpful. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was wondering, can you switch this slide that you just went to one more time? I just
Oh,
want to see if I've seen this movie or not.
This one.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
I definitely have seen that one. Okay, cool.
Okay, yeah, just to mention that since it did show up there
Yes.
briefly, this was a movie called Sliding Doors, which is really interesting. I recommend it. But Gwyneth Paltrow is the actress, where her character, it shows like two possible paths depending on whether or not she made this subway. I think if I remember right, it's something to do with somebody gets in her way and keeps her from getting on the subway. But the whole movie unfolds both possible timelines in the future. And it looks at first like, oh wow, she's really lucky in one of them and unlucky in the other, but in the end it's kind of more of the opposite. So it kind of points to the fact that you can't predict what one small change will have an impact later, kind of thing. So you should check that out sometime. It's old enough you can probably find it free streaming or something. So.
It's on YouTube.
Okay.
Or
Cool.
was.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, other questions, comments, complaints? Yeah.
I would say one thing that has been said a bunch before, but just I think an important thing to keep in mind too when we're talking about sin and suffering is that in Romans it says that we know that all things will work out for the good of those who love God. And so even if, like, as Christians, we struggle ourselves with, like, why is God letting this happen to me?
Mm-hmm.
Like, ultimately, it's about trust. Like, we're allowed to ask questions, but at the end of the day, like, if you don't have that trust that God is just, that God is perfect, then it'll be really hard for you to say, like, oh, well, I know He's going to work it out for my good. Like, it's really hard for you to say that if you don't have trust and if you don't have faith. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind. Like, God, He is going to work it out for our good. And maybe we don't see that because we have, like, kind of tunnel vision. We only see the here and now. But God sees all of it, and we don't.
That's a great summary. Thank you for sharing that. It's a good way to kind of probably end it, thinking about that aspect. And from Romans 8:28 there, yeah, we have that confidence as Christians, and we have confidence in Christianity. You know, this whole year we've been giving arguments for the existence of God and the truth of Christianity. If you have all these positive reasons, even if you have a few uncertainties about the problem of evil or doubts or challenges, you can trust God because we have this whole weight of evidence and that kind of a thing. So, and then sometimes, you know, you do find out maybe years later why something happened, that there was some good purpose in it. So, yeah, it's good to reflect upon. Any other real quick comment or question?
I guess a quick comment is that the fact that we have evil and suffering in the world is what gave God the opportunity to show His love for us in the most profound way possible.
Good point. I should have really mentioned that as the ultimate redemption on the cross. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
We do have to be careful though when we're talking about the problem of evil, that it doesn't get flipped the other way where people try to use evil as being necessary in order for good to exist.
Yeah, it's really the opposite, right?
Sometimes it goes, yeah.
Yeah, evil is the privation of the good. Going back to Augustine helps kind of elucidate that principle, which makes sense, right?
Right. The problem with evil is just it's easy for people that get hung up on it. It's easy for people to spout just a lot of things, right? Because there's just so much. There's so
a
much.
lot of problems in the history of the world.
There's a lot of problems.
Yeah.
The one thing that I have found in my time talking with people is to switch that focus, kind of going on what this gentleman said, but to switch that focus and go, I hear you that there's a lot of messed up things in this world as a result of being fallen and broken. I get that, but I always tell people, I'm like, but that's not your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is what's called the problem of good, right? So argue for me, why would you expect good? Right? Because you have to answer the question, why good?
Why is there any good in the world?
Why does anything good happen? And only until you can thoroughly answer, which outside of the Christian system of belief, you can't answer that question. But that's the biggest issue. They want to present it as evil being the biggest issue, but it's really not. And I think we get cornered sometimes because we do have, and it is, you're right, it is one of the toughest questions that as believers we're going to face when we're talking to our secular world. I get that, but always remember that they only can argue that because somehow they have a conception of good that is truly outside of the Christian framework, is truly unjustified.
It's just kind of taking it as given. Yeah. All right. Well, we are out of time. Thank you guys for being here. So, Seth, we're going to Sonic, right?
Yes. Looks like as long as I don't check my phone and there's a bunch of storms about to hit, then yeah, it looks like the weather's worked out well enough that we
there
can
was
get started.
something about a severe thunderstorm watch.
There was,
But
but the forecast seems to have gotten a lot better.
And
Yeah.
the watch is not warning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is still a watch, but